It's time to take command with former NFL tight end Logan Paulsen and former Commanders beat reporter Craig Hoffman.
What's up? What's happening? Welcome in. It's the Take Command podcast. That's Logan Paulsen. I'm Craig Hoffman. And Logan, you don't know this yet, but I'm gonna drop a surprise on you. You ready for it? For anyone that's listening to this show right now, you're clearly a Commanders fan. You're interested in the Commanders. What if I told you I was talking with Mikey Sainristil later today?
That'd be cool, huh? That'd be great.
Yeah, so you can check that out on the Hoffman Show, on the radio, on the Team 980 a little later today. And I do think we'll probably drop that here in the Take Command feed tomorrow. So if you're like, I got stuff I got to do this afternoon, perhaps you've already missed it. It's like 6 o'clock and you just got home, but as you cook dinner, Take Command, that's your go-to on Thursday nights. Okay, that's cool. Keep listening to this show, and you can listen to Mikey tomorrow when we drop it here in the feed. So definitely looking forward to chatting with the Commanders Rookie Corner a little bit later today. But for now, it is Giants preview time. That's what we do on the Thursday podcast. And this is our second Giants preview of the season. Logan, generally speaking, going back on your 10 years of playing experience, how different is the second time around playing a team? And especially when it's, this was like early season Giants. You had week 2, and now you're kind of getting the mid-season. And obviously, Commanders, same thing. Who the Commanders were week 2. In some ways, like that was the last game of early season Commanders. I feel like they've been that was their biggest jump that they made, was from week 2 to week 3, and then they've just consistently grown on top of that. But how different are these two teams this time around, and what are the challenges of facing a team the second time?
Yeah, I mean, I think the teams are just seemingly very different so far, and we'll get into that more specifically. But kind of generally, the second matchup I think is always kind of interesting, because if you lost the game, for example, you'd go back and you'd say, oh, like these are some plays from the first matchup that we could have hit on, and these are some things from a coverage or from a run, or from a front standpoint, or from a blitz standpoint that they did that we weren't really expecting. So we're going to prep that, and we're also going to try and anticipate some new stuff. And so I think that's one way of going about it. If you win the first game, you say, what did we do really well? And then what do we anticipate them doing to stop it? And so sometimes you kind of, I don't want to say run it back, but it's a very, very similar game plan to the first time, because you're like, based on this defensive coordinator's history or this offensive coordinator's history, they're not going to change that much. And so we feel really good about this plan. And again, if it's not going well, then you kind of switch it up. I think the other thing, and that's more coaching based, and that's like, again, something when you talk with, for me, it was, Kyle or Sean or whoever it was, like that was something they'd always kind of be mulling over. And I think good coaches are always kind of mulling that over. So I kind of expect Cliff to be having those conversations, Joe Whitt Jr. to be having those conversations with his staff. And that's part of the fun of these divisional games. You guys do know each other really, really well. The other thing is, as a player, you get a really good feel, especially for some of the new players on the team, you get a feel for their personnel. You're like, oh, like this, like Dexter Lawrence is maybe a good example. Like, oh, he really likes this type of pass rush move in this situation. And when he lines up like this, I know he's really going to try and attack my edge and try to beat me that way. And so I'm going to set a little bit differently. And so there is that kind of, there's the big chess match between the teams. Then there's the smaller kind of micro chess match, which is always fun, because if you have a guy figured out, it's a great feeling. It's like, oh my gosh, I've got this guy's number. I see him twice a year. It's awesome. Like I remember, like Justin Tucker back in the day, like
Justin Tuck, Giants defensive end.
Yeah, Justin Tuck.
It'd be cool if you dominated the Baltimore kicker, though. You're out there laying him out every time you're on teams.
And like it was like him and Osi Umenyiora and JPP. And I remember being like so nervous about the first game. And then you get out there, and they had a very specific way of playing the run that really fit with how I like to block. And I was like, oh, like I'm fine. Like this is and so then the next game you kind of tweak your technique a little bit and fall into it. But it's really cool to kind of have that data on file, and like if they get in this front, because I've seen it, I know they're bringing this blitz. And so I think that's always why the second matchup, and, hopefully long term, the third, fourth, fifth matchup under this staff are always going to be interesting, because they have that familiarity, which allows for better performance and allows for that kind of that chess match that's always happening. So.
Yeah, for sure. I think when you talk about the team approach, this game in particular is interesting because the Commanders won the first matchup I don't think they were particularly thrilled with a lot of things from that game. Like it was 21-18, the final. That's the Austin Seibert 7 field goal game, the kicker podium game, and hopefully the only one ever. All due respect to Austin, all the kickers everywhere, but like you want, unless it's a game-winning 60-yarder out, to win 45-42, like you want your offense being the star of the show. But I think that's the thing that, like, if you're Washington offensively, you probably look back and go, we didn't punt in this game, but we got to be a lot better. We got to find more explosive plays. We can't just move the ball between the 20s. And I think that's especially poignant coming off a game where you also struggled in the red zone. So I think that is something to watch in this game. Obviously, is Washington going to move the football? Probably. They move the football at everybody. But their ability to finish or not is probably the determining factor on whether or not I want to say whether or not they win, because they won without finishing, I guess, in some ways the first time around. And they found ways to win against Chicago, for instance. What a way it was to win without finishing the red zone. But certainly whether or not they have one of these big offensive explosions like they had against Arizona, Cincinnati, et cetera, it comes down to whether or not they finish in the red zone. And the fact that they struggle with that in the first game, I think if you're Cliff, is probably the biggest point of emphasis here. But it does kind of, I think, change the framing of that win, lost, what did we do well, what did we not? Because you almost feel like you lost a little bit more than you did, because you just come out of that game not as pleased as you'd like to.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I think the thing you talked about there that I like honed in on was finish, because in the first game it was all about finishing, and when you look at how they didn't finish, it's the false starts, it's the illegal formations, it's penalties in the red zone that stall drives. And when you look at them against the Bears, it's a lot of the same stuff, and this time it's illegal man downfield twice, and people say, oh, they didn't score on that first one, but that gets them a first down, it gets them inside the 10, the completion on the screen to Diami, right? And then there's obviously the touchdown to OZ. And so can we get those details cleaned up? And I also felt like there was thinking back and reviewing my notes from the game, there was kind of a labored element to the offense, which hasn't been there over the course of the year. And so can we, as an offensive staff and as players in the offense, kind of hone in on the details this week? I think that's going to be extremely important, right? To kind of, again, and in some ways, I think it's good that this happened versus Chicago, that it was a little bit sluggish, because it does allow for a nice refocusing period, where you're like, okay, this is not who we are. This is not who we want to be. This is how we get our details where we want them to be. And again, nothing I think is going to change dramatically about Cliff's offense or what he does. But I think the attention to detail, which has been so excellent throughout the year, just needs to be honed in on, and specifically in the red zone. And I think when you look at the game right after the New York Giants game, the first time, it's the Cincinnati Bengals, right?
Boy, were they locked in that day.
They were locked in for sure. And so I think that what I'm expecting is a similar kind of locked in phase. And I think if they can kind of handle that and handle those details and refocus as an offense, I think they're going to be in good shape.
For sure. And we'll get into those details in a lot more detail. I don't know how else to say that coming up in a second. And obviously we'll detail the defensive side of the ball for Washington as well. But last thing I just want to make on kind of the general second time around, bounce back, whatever. On paper, this could be a trap game. The Steelers game in a couple weeks is one of their biggest games of the season, if not their toughest remaining opponent, depending on how the Eagles are playing week in and week out. And nobody, including the Eagles, knows how they're going to play on a week in, week out basis. So if you look at it on paper, you're coming off this huge emotional last second win. Steelers are coming in next. The Giants kind of stink. And so if you're looking at this on paper, the way that most of us from the outside and most rational people, even players often in a lot of teams and a lot of locker rooms in this league look at it, this has trap game written all over it. But this is where I think DQ's approach, and as someone who played for Dan, like you can talk about this far better than I can, but on a principle level, like the idea of the tell the truth Monday, that win or lose, we're going to come in and we're going to look at this through a neutral lens. And we're going to say, this was good, this was bad, this is what we need to improve on, this is what we need to keep doing. That approach week in, week out does not change. And so I think this is where we, again, not to say that it guarantees anything, but this is where we test that theory. And if they lose, then it's not going to be because they emotionally weren't ready for it. But this is kind of the beauty of the Tell the Truth Monday film session, which, hey, this was really good for 3.5 quarters. This is where we lost it in the fourth. This was really good between the 20s. This is where we need to clean it up in the red zone. Whether that Hail Mary falls incomplete or not, that's what that Monday film session would have looked like. And as long as the guys were as locked in because they are with winning as they would have been had they lost, then I think that they'll be ready to go mentally on all the details they need to for this game on Sunday.
And I think that's something the staff's done like such an excellent job with throughout the season so far. It's like anytime, I do that show with Dan on the game plan, and every time we're like, oh, what are you thinking about, midway point of the season, or what do you think about this game? He's like, where our feet are right now. And I think he understands, and every coach understands this, but at least he expresses it in a very clear way, very, very specific way that, hey, we are about this game. And every game in the NFL is a trap game. As much as people want to say, oh, this game has the potential, every team in the NFL is good. Every team in the NFL wants to win. Every team in the NFL is composed of professionals. And I know we've said that before. I know that probably sounds like hard old NFL player Logan, but that's just a fact. Like, that's just how the game is. And like,
dude, look at last weekend in the league.
Yes.
Let's just say that our picks on all the shows, not as good this past week because a lot of wacky stuff happened.
And that's the difference to me between high school, college, and the NFL. It's that you have a professional element to these guys, and they're going to do whatever it takes to win. Like, I remember I had a conversation. I've brought this up before. A conversation with an old position coach that I had who was like, "I'm going back to college," and I was like, "Why?" He's like, it's just too hard. You have to be too dialed in at the NFL level every single week. Like, when I go coach at Alabama, like, we get 5 games of like, Northern Illinois State, and it's like, we'll win that one, no problem. We don't have to lose any sleep. But here it's like, you got to grind them out every single week. And I think Dan, having played for him, Dan having talked to him now, really understands that. And I think that's something that's extremely important. And you can understand it, but it's also hard and very difficult to get the team to understand that. And I think that's where veterans like Bobby Wagner and Zach Ertz and these guys that have been around for a long time and have the process really locked in are so valuable to the roster, because it's like, hey guys, like, this is a marathon, not a sprint. We got to be locked in on this one, and we got to be locked in on the next one. We're not thinking about vacations in 6 weeks. We're thinking about this game, and that's what all of our focus is. And I think that's excellent. And it's going to show. And every single week we talk about it, right? We talk about, this is the game. Like, Carolina could be a trap game.
Right.
The Bears, right? Every single week it pops up. And it's about the mental focus for this team and the leadership of this team. And that's why the NFL, to me, is so cool.
And it doesn't hurt when your 23-year-old quarterback also gets it. And he does. And he talked about, he was asked at the podium on Wednesday, what were the 24 to 48 hours like after? And he was like, pretty normal. Like, yeah, I had a lot of people, asking me stuff or whatever, a lot of texts, whatever. But I went about my routine. I did the same things I always do. And I think Jaden and a lot of the guys on this team fundamentally understand that if you like this feeling of winning, if you like the things that are coming with it, then you have to keep doing the things that you did to make you win. You didn't solve a problem that all of a sudden you don't have to do those things anymore. You have to keep doing that. You continually earn it. And the fact that he understands that at 23, 8 games in his career, puts him ahead of some guys that have been in the league for 8 years. And they've got a lot of guys in that locker room that have been in the league for 8 years that understand that. It's guys that have been in the league for 8 games that understand that, and everybody in between. So be fun to watch, see how they prepare. And I think that's that kind of sets up the actual details of the preparation. So let's dive into that. Take command. That's Logan. I am Craig. And everything always, Logan, in football, it starts with the run game. It starts in the trenches. It starts up front, or perhaps how the second level gets down into the trenches. What have you noticed when you're watching the Giants on film? Because this is a team that has really good personnel in the front, but the rushing numbers would suggest that they're actually not very good in that department.
Yeah, and it's a little bit confounding. Like, when you watch them, it's because they have Dexter Lawrence, who is maybe the second best defensive player in the NFL. They've got, Brian Burns, who I've always been a little bit lukewarm on, but seems to be coming on as a pass rusher. They've got Bobby Okereke. I'm not sure exactly.
Okereke, I believe, is the correct.
And they've got Micah McFadden, the other middle linebacker. And those guys are good. They're good football players. Like, when you watch Okereke, like, he is big, he's physical, he's fast, he's instinctive. And so you're like, man, with this personnel, they should be pretty good at stopping the run. The problem is, like, when you watch them against Pittsburgh, when you watch them against Philly, I think the front is fine, but like, in any NFL structure, like the safeties have to come in and fit the runs, right? They kind of play. Shane Bowen kind of plays. He plays all sorts of different coverages: cover 6, cover 4, a little bit of cover 3, a little bit of man, right? But in that quarters coverage and that cover 6 coverage, those safeties have to fit those runs from depth, and let's say if it's quarters and the corners have to fit, right? The problem is like they don't seem to be fitting runs well. They're fine individually. Like you'll see Dexter Lawrence like throw the center down and make a tackle, and it's like, oh my gosh, that's awesome. Or Azeez Ojulari kind of beat the tight end and make a tackle for loss, like whatever. But on a down-to-down basis, like there's a play against Pittsburgh where Brian Burns is supposed to set the edge, and he kind of loops in because he's like trying to pursue to make the tackle, and the running back's like, there's no force player to the offensive left. I'm just going to run for 30 yards because there's nobody here, and that happens way too much, versus Philly. They were pretty kind of, obviously Pittsburgh's more like a little bit more perimeter. Like the stat that gets floated around there is they're the worst team in the NFL at defending perimeter runs. That's not exactly true because, for example, like when you block a duo run and you hit the cutback, that's an inside run, but you're hitting the cutback to the place where the player isn't anymore, right? And so you see a lot of that type of stuff, guys just getting out of position. Philly ran a lot of kind of Wanda where people aren't fitting the run correctly or guys are getting gapped out. I can't tell how many times I've seen where the corner is the force player or the defensive end's the force player and the running back just runs around the force player and it's like a 40-yard gain. I really don't understand why that happens to them all the time. And I don't know if it's a technique thing or if it's a schematic thing, but it comes up. I've watched 3 games. Every game it pops up. So I do think finding ways to, again, attack that weakness is going to be super important. And obviously in the first matchup, Cliff did a great job of that. And he did it a little bit different than Philly. He did it a little different than Pittsburgh would do it. This is the game where they threw all those perimeter screens and then they got the Giants to widen out and kind of cover numbers. They had, if there's 3 receivers to the right, they'd have 4 defenders, and they had light boxes, and you're able to get these huge gashes with B-Rob and Austin Eckler. So I think that's probably something I would expect to see a similar version of again. But I think Shane Bowen's a smart guy. I think he's going to find a way to kind of say, hey, how do we take away these quick screens, and how do we kind of force them to run the ball in a more conventional way? And that being said, I think Cliff has done a good job of saying Jaden's playing better. We don't need to throw as many screens. We can run a more conventional, traditional offense. So that's, again, like we talked about at the top, like, obviously we need to run the football. How do we run the football? From the first matchup in week 2, like we've changed in terms of how we run the football. And how does that now fit into Shane Bowen? And how does Shane Bowen now fit off of what he anticipates us doing?
Time for the Craig has stats portion of the podcast. I got to shout out our guy Sam Fortier who looked this up for me. But the Commanders rush success rate. So success rate is basically on first down, do you get success rate is do you get half the yardage you need on first and second down, or do you get third down? Obviously, to be successful, you need all of the yardage. So if you're at first and 10, do you get 5+ yards? If you're second 8, do you get 4+ yards? That's the thresholds for success rate. Commanders rush success rate is 42.5%, which is 7th in the NFL overall. But what I wanted to do was test my theory. Logan, we talked about this on the pod on Tuesday, of Brian Robinson's efficacy. And this doesn't even paint the whole picture of B-Rob, because I would love to know like their play action success rate, for instance, when he is on the field versus not, when he's the guy getting the ball fake versus not. But they're 42.5% in general. The number 1 team in the league is Detroit at 46.9. If you take just B-Rob's runs, 48.4.
Oh, wow.
So they would be first in the league if you just take the Brian Robinson runs. Their Commanders' rush success rate without Robinson on the field, 33.7, would be 26th.
Wow.
So B-Rob is absolutely killing it. And the offense as a whole is way more effective with him. And I do, like, when I hear you talk about, like, oh, the contained players are not doing their job. If you're Shane Bowen, I don't know what you do about that. Like there's no scheme that you can pick that's like, oh, okay, this is how we fix the fact that we can't contain anybody. This run fit doesn't have a contained player. And so it comes down to Cliff kind of forcing the issue on some of that stuff. And I think this is where the variety in the Commanders' run game really comes to play, because they can, if they find a weakness, They will spam it. That is modern NFL football. If you can't defend duo, we'll just run duo. If you can't defend the GT stuff on the perimeter, we'll do that. And the fact that the Commanders can do all of that, and to your point, they also are not as reliant on some of the screen stuff, although that stuff still has been pretty good for them. I think there's a game. I actually was talking about this with Sam. There's a game coming where they go back to that in a heavy way because they think they can get a team. And I wonder if maybe the Giants are that team. But they haven't used the screen game, wide receiver or running back, as much in recent weeks. And I do wonder, how they stress the Giants in that way, considering that was such a big part of their game plan the first time around.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, it's like, this is more technical, like kind of nerdy football stuff. If you're the Giants, is, for example, like we're talking about how they're not running perimeter runs. They're running like downhill runs that the back reads out. And obviously B-Rob, like you talked about, has been playing great. I think B-Rob's excellent at that just in general. So that's something I think to keep an eye on for sure. Also, like technically, I don't know if they've got guys that understand how to play the run from an edge position, right? So for example, one of the runs versus Philly, they're running kind of this kind of like mid-zone, right, to the offensive left. Philly is with Saquon Barkley. And Azeez Ojulari is in what I would characterize as a really good position on the tackle. He's got two hands on the tackle's chest. He's totally boxed the run. And when you box the run, your shoulders are square to the line of scrimmage, but you're like up the field a little bit. And Saquon Barkley just literally like takes it, bounces around the guy, and he doesn't react quick enough to get there. So I don't know if that's like a personnel thing for them. Also, I think the secondary is not fitting it well. I think I said that already. But I think I'm really curious to see what Cliff does. To me, I think they're going to fall in kind of in between Philly and Pittsburgh. And what I mean by that is Philly kind of was in this mid-zone kind of gap scheme era. And then I think the Pittsburgh Steelers were kind of predominantly gap scheme because that's kind of what they want to be, downhill with Najee
Harris.
Harris, yeah. And so I think Cliff can, like you said, has done a really good job of being like, oh, hey, we can attack the perimeter with our our center guard pull stuff, or we can do counter, we can do duo, we can do wandas. And I think those runs, while not traditional perimeter runs, could potentially be very effective against the Giants because of how they can potentially bounce to the perimeter. And we just talked about how their defensive end personnel, their secondary personnel, which are fitting kind of these runs, have not done a great job of that because they're kind of getting out of position versus these runs. So I can't wait to see how that looks, and I can't wait to see B-Rob run the football a ton. Also, I think, like you alluded to there, like what's the wrinkle? Like I think they do a good job each week of kind of adding a little bit of wrinkle. Maybe this is a different run. This is a different formation. Week 1 or week 2, whenever that game was, it was, we're going to throw a ton of screens. We're going to get you to widen out. We're going to make soft boxes and we're going to hit it. They might do the same thing, like, because it worked. And that's, again, where this chess match of this killed you guys week 1. What's your solution to that? Because the other crazy thing about defense is I can't allocate all the resources I want to stop the screen without making myself susceptible to the run. So What is his solution? Do they blitz us a little bit more? Do they play different coverages than we expect? So I think that's something, again, that's going to be really compelling is after getting gashed on the ground, after getting gashed with all these screens, you can't just come into the game plan and say we're going to do the same thing, even though our offense, the Commanders' offense, has evolved slightly since then.
Yeah, one of the things that they have figured out, I think, too, in the screen game, they being Cliff and the staff, is who should be catching those things, too. Like week 2 was the week that they tried to get Terry the ball a bunch in that regard, and it didn't go anywhere. And they've figured out since how to get the ball to Terry, the routes that work for him, but also that Diami, who came into the league as like the deep ball guy, is maybe the best screen runner on the team.
Yeah.
And so like they're hitting Diami and OZ with those a lot more. And I think that's something that's to watch as well. It's like if they like the looks, but they need guys in different spots to execute it at the level, they have that figured out now more than they did earlier in the season. So that's something to watch for as well. In terms of passing the ball otherwise, that is where going against this Giants defense becomes challenging. Their back end has some issues, but up front, their pass rush is nasty, man. And they got after Jaden the first game. They got 5 sacks, and that's kind of been who they are. They are a team that leads the NFL in sacks by a wide margin, by the way. They got 35. The next highest team is the Broncos with 30. So what is it that makes their pass rush so effective, and how does Washington prevent Jaden from getting hit a whole bunch like he did in week 2?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is that, Dexter Lawrence is a beast, and his ability to create pressures from the nose is very special. like in the Pittsburgh game, I think that's a great example. His ability to, and I think that was the backup center, but he just made that guy look like he doesn't belong on an NFL field. And I know that's probably not true. I know that guy's probably a fine football player, but that's just a tough draw. And so his ability to kind of turn shoulders, his ability for such a big man to kind of get vertical into that gap off the shoulder of the center. And he's so big that the guard has a hard time closing it down. He had probably 3 pressures that didn't turn into sacks that he didn't get the credit for the sack, but was a sack for the defense because it's an immediate flush for the quarterback. And so first and foremost, how do you handle him? And again, his pressure to sack ratio is very, very high. He's converting pressures into sacks at a very high rate, probably because he's so close to the quarterback. And then you look at Brian Burns, a guy who I think is maybe slightly overrated, but is playing really good football as a pass rusher. And when you see him rush the edge, he gets vertical and can really attack that perimeter. Again, think about it. Dexter Lawrence is powering right up the middle. The quarterback steps back. Brian Burns is a demon off the edge of the defense, right? They've also started using him in different ways in terms of, hey, we're not just going to have you heat the edge because you are so athletic, because you are so bendy. We're going to run some line stunts and you're going to be the looper. And he does a really nice job with that. And I think that's a really good utilization package for him to just maximize his skill set. And then you couple that with a guy like Azeez Ojulari, who is kind of a designated pass rush specialist, but because Kayvon Thibodeau is on IR, he's in more. And Kayvon Thibodeau, again, high draft pick, big name notoriety. Rushing the passer, they're better with Azeez Ojulari on the field. He has 6 sacks. I think he's only played in 4 games. He has been very prolific. He's on a little bit of a heater. So, and again, very similar to Brian Burns in terms of how he wins. We're attacking high, and I think it all stems with Dexter Lawrence being able to compress the pocket. And you kind of say, how does that fit with the Commanders? Cliff's done a great job of understanding how to chip help, how to send slides, how to use different protections to maximize guys. The problem with a good nose is that you can't really give as much help as you want. You can send slides, right? But Dexter Lawrence has shown an ability to do it. And this is Fred Smoot's favorite stat about Tyler Biadasz, but he has not given up a sack to Dexter Lawrence. I don't know what the time duration is, if it's the last 3 years, but
twice a year because he was in division in Dallas too. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah. So it's, I don't know the exact time duration, but that is going to be a really compelling matchup because he really is the engine that drives that defense in terms of pass rush. He drives them from a run defense standpoint. I think he's a little overhyped. I'm going to put this in air quotes because he's one of the best players in football. It's hard to be overhyped at anything. I don't think he's as good at stopping the run as his frame would give him credit for, but he definitely makes up for that because he's such a disruptive person when it comes to the pass. So that to me is going to be a really interesting dynamic to kind of keep an eye on with that group.
To be clear, anybody in New York who might want to clip that out and say Logan Paulson says Dexter Lawrence is overhyped, he called him the second best defensive player in football 10 minutes ago.
Yeah, and I just said it right before that. It's a modifier. Everyone thinks he's 350, he's going to stop the run away. He does it fine, but it's not like you're watching Ted Washington out there, right? You can move him off the spot sometimes. And again, he makes plays in the run game. It's just his superpower, kind of surprisingly, is he can rush the passer really, really well.
Yeah. Ted Washington sounds like a fake founding father.
Doesn't it? Yeah. Do you remember him, though, for the Bears? Dude, huge man. I think he was 6'6", 6'5", but I think he weighed 375. They used to call him Mount Washington.
56 years old now. Played back in the day. Bills and Bears. He weighed 375. He sure did. He was 6'5", 375.
Big man.
I did not remember Ted Washington.
You don't get a nickname like Mount Washington unless you're absolutely enormous.
No, but it does sound like he signed the Declaration of Independence with Benjamin Franklin. I'm just saying. The back end of that Giants defense, real quick, they've obviously had some issues. They benched Deonte Banks last week. They've come out and said he's back in this week. That was a temporary thing. Why have they struggled so much? And is this something that if you're Washington, is this hey, we need to take advantage of it because they're bad in zone and miscommunicate things, or there's a ton of air? Are they bad at man-to-man? What's the back end stuff, and how does Washington take advantage of it?
I don't know. I really don't know because when I watch them, I'm they're actually playing pretty good. You know what I mean? To my eye, again, are they perfect? No. They're not a top 10 secondary or anything like that. But they've got Banks matching the number one receiver usually, and that's a tough draw. Like obviously against AJ Brown, I think he did some good stuff, but AJ Brown's, top 5 receiver in football. He's going to make you look like a fool sometimes. Drew Phillips, the guy from their slot player, Andrew Phillips, is playing exceptional football as a run stopper and in man-to-man coverage. Does he get beat? Absolutely. He got beat by Kayvon Austin on the Monday night game, but like that happens. Like, you know what I mean? Like on a down-to-down consistent basis, he's doing a good job. And then Tyler Nubin, the rookie from Minnesota, I think is playing fine. Like he's not like a game record by any stretch of the imagination, but they're playing fine. And I think that's something that's a little confusing to me, why there's so much negative conversation around them in the back end, is because I think they're fine. And usually that's enough to win football games. I think the one thing, and we'll talk about this when we get to the offense probably, is their offense is a little bit sluggish, and it puts a lot of pressure on the defense to be really, really good. And I think I will say this, I think the Giants are a good unit. I don't think they're a great unit. And so they need to have that kind of symbiotic relationship with the offense, where the offense is supporting them with game flow and time of possession and things like that. And they're just not getting it. So I think you are seeing them, the temperatures turned up a little bit on the defense. And as a result, some pipes are starting to burst. And I think that's what this feels like to me. And obviously the Banks thing is interesting to me because it feels like, again, when you're watching down to down, nothing pops out from like a negative play standpoint. It feels like there's some effort, kind of coaching off the field type relationship stuff that's going on there, that it doesn't strike me as a play issue necessarily. An effort issue maybe, but not like I'm bad in coverage in the same way that like, I can't think of a good example, but like, where someone is obviously playing poorly and needs to be benched. Like Anthony Richardson. Like Anthony Richardson's playing bad football. He needs to sit down. Joe Flacco takes over. Like that one's very clear. I'm not really sure why, because to me, he's playing okay, and like okay secondary play is fine in the NFL.
Yeah, Emmanuel's had stretches like that in his first couple of years where it's just like, this is not the leverage we asked you to play. Like,
yes,
we need to sit you down and do this. And so maybe it's, I don't know, maybe it's not that, it's the effort side of it, where it's just like, man, like we need you every single snap. Like if you're gonna shadow a number one guy, like you have to be locked in at all times, and perhaps he's not ready for that responsibility. That is kind of the thing though with the game flow. It's like it comes down to opportunities. And we talk about this, again, let's talk about a guy that we praise way more than people wish we did, like Benjamin St-Juste, right? Like BSJ is a good corner down in and down out, but eventually you'll probably get him because he's not, Sauce Gardner. Right. And if the more opportunities you have with all them snaps, because your offense isn't doing what it needs to, the better chance that you're going to get to the one that pops. And it sounds like maybe that's what's happening a little bit with this Giants defense. Take Command Podcast. Craig Hoffman here. Logan Paulson there. Let's talk about the Commanders defense now, who's coming off a 3.5 quarter shutout again. This is the second straight week that has happened. Obviously, the quarter that the Bears put up, though, in the fourth is concerning. But the Giants offense has really, really struggled. When you look back at that first matchup and how the Giants offense has evolved since then, let's start there. And then, because the Commanders defense has evolved as well, but the Giants offense has evolved or perhaps devolved since week 2. What are you seeing from them?
Yeah, so I think they're very similar. They feel very similar in the sense that, like, when you're watching an offense, sometimes you're like, oh, this is consistently good. This feels easy. It feels like the quarterback's in a good spot. It feels like the O-line really understands the plan, and it kind of flows very nicely. With the Giants, everything kind of feels hard, for lack of a better word, right? It feels like it's a labor. And it's not that they can't find explosive plays, because they do. It's not that they can't run the football effectively, because they do. It's just there are moments in the game where you're like, they're going to screw this up. Like they can't sustain this level of play for as long as they do. And I think that shows up in the Pittsburgh game. They're kind of really screen heavy early. They did a really good job of being patient, kind of ran the ball effectively early. And then they find that explosive play to Darius Slayton. They find another one later in the game. Malik Neighbors is converting on first down. And then there's a penalty. And it's just like, we're in 2nd and 12. And then Pittsburgh just pins its ears back, and we can't, as a team, as an offense, overcome those situations. And obviously that's hard. That's hard football. But when you look at good teams like the Kansas City Chiefs, the Detroit Lions, San Francisco, Commanders to a certain extent, you're like, we're still in the fight. Like, we can manage this with a good play call. We can protect this and we can elevate. And I think that's maybe the one thing that seems to have regressed the most for the Giants from the first matchup is I actually thought the Giants offensive line was playing pretty good. I think they went out and they made some free agent signings that were really impressive. Like Jeremiah Emmanuel, or is that his name? Emmanuel? But he's the...
I'm blanking on his name too, but I don't...
It's
Illuminor.
Thank you. Yeah. Illuminor. Like, I think he's playing good football. Like, and he's a definitely an upgrade over Evan Neal. And then obviously their left tackle gets banged up. He's out. They're having to start a different player there. Chris Hubbard, who was on the San Francisco's practice squad, and he's a fine player, but he's definitely not the guy that was there before, who's a Pro Bowl caliber guy. So I think that's showing up a little bit in terms of pass protection. And I think the guy you do not want having bad pass pro is Daniel Jones. Like, he just does not handle it super well. Like, there's a couple clips where I'm watching sacks that Pittsburgh had. And I actually think on the whole in that game, there was a really good protection plan from the offensive coordinator there. And it just... there were times where guys weren't open down the field. He's holding the football. And instead of making quick decisions, getting the ball out, he just runs into sacks. And you're kind of like, this is a guy who needs to have excellent pockets, very clean operation, and he can deliver throws. He made some really nice throws in that Pittsburgh game. He made some nice throws against Philadelphia. Like, they show up. It's just the consistency isn't there where you're like, this guy is really elevating the group, or this offense can kind of carry the team. Like, they're a fine offense, but sometimes it feels like they're pulling teeth. And I think that's the best description of the Giants offense is it's okay, not great. And they need to be better. They need to be better for the construction of the team for them to win football games, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about this before. Like, your stars need to play like stars because you're paying them to carry a certain amount of the load. And this is kind of the issue with the Giants is they paid Daniel Jones. And I don't think it was indefensible, but it was definitely questionable at the time.
Yeah.
Because the year prior had played pretty good ball, and then he got hurt, and then they gave him $40 million. And not that $40 million is the most expensive quarterback in the league, but it's still a lot. It's a high percentage of your salary cap. And like, you need to get that kind of production out of Daniel Jones, and this offense does not. You need your first round picks to play really well. And they got two guys at tackle who aren't giving them anything, whether it's because of performance in Evan Neal's case or injury in Andrew Thomas's case. And so it's just really hard to operate when the places that you've invested resources don't actually produce. And that is a huge story, if not the main story on the offensive side with the New York Giants. So for the Washington defense, they obviously did a pretty good job against Jones and company in the first matchup. Would you have a similar game plan? I guess I'm guessing yes, because if the offense hasn't really changed much, like, what is there to change?
Yeah, so for me, I think it's not so much about what the Commanders need to change, it's how the Commanders have changed. And I guess when you watch the last couple of games, I think they've just done a great job of buying into the details of the defense and understanding what offenses are trying to do to them. And I think the one thing that jumps out, like I was watching some clips the other day, just kind of getting ready for Coach's Show, and there's a third down where, the Bears motion to a bunch, and I forget who's on the point. It's Sanderstill, or I think it might be Sanderstill, and he gives a signal like, this is how we're handling the bunch. Everybody matches the bunch well. They handle the crossers well. They're in good phase. Joe Whitt Jr. has an excellent call. They drop the two defensive ends out to help kind of handle the mesh route that's on the field. And I thought that's like one example of many in that game of how they are playing their leverages better. They're playing their coverages better. They're communicating better. And I think going back and watching the Giants game, one of the things that absolutely killed them was man-to-man coverage stuff. Like, they just were not on the same page. The guys were getting picked, they were getting knocked off stuff, and they weren't playing with correct leverage. And obviously, a guy like Malik Neighbors kind of eats you up a little bit. I think he had 10 catches in that game. So to me, Joe Whitt Jr. and the staff have done a great job of getting guys, and the players have done a great job of buying in and kind of adapting the new techniques. I think that coupled with this pass rush that is kind of pass rush by committee. You got Frankie Louvi, you got Dorrance Armstrong, you got Payne with pressures, you got Jerzon with some pressures, right? They're all kind of working together as a group, and they understand the timing of a good rush. They understand how to affect the passer in a way, like especially in that Chicago game, that really, really helps the secondary out. So I think both of those evolutions are very apparent when you watch the film. And I think if you just play that game with that level of consistency, again, Daniel Jones is going to find a couple explosive plays in this game. Darius Slayton is an explosive weapon. He's not a super consistent down-to-down guy. Malik Neighbors is an explosive weapon. But if you understand what they're trying to do in terms of getting him the football, it's going to get bogged down. It's going to get a little sluggish. Obviously, I think one thing, maybe the biggest thing, I'm not that worried about coverage anymore, is Tyrone Tracy and how well he's been running the football. Like against Pittsburgh, I thought Daboll did an excellent job of getting in kind of this 3-by-1, so tight end to the nub to the right, 3 receivers to the left, and the way Pittsburgh played to it allowed these double teams on the interior to really sink and really push. And Tracy did an excellent job of getting downhill. He's explosive. He hits the run hard. And when you look at some of the issues that the Commanders had against the Bears, against literally every team they played, it's the consistency was stopping the run. They were significantly better at it, but this guy's going to hurt you, and they're going to do this a lot. So what's the plan for that? Because I do think you've gotten much better, much more consistent in the back end. And again, that's the back end, that's the rush. But how do we consistently stop the run? Because the thing in the Pittsburgh game that allowed them to stay in it was how effectively they ran the football, and it led to explosive play action shots down the field. Can you limit that as much as possible while also taking away Malik Neighbors, who's a very dynamic playmaker? These are the questions. Again, I think they're playing much better. Joe Whitt Jr. is going to have to come up with some answers.
As always, efficiency on first and second down is really important. But I think the one thing to watch for, too, on third down, later on in that first matchup, Joe basically doubled Malik Neighbors. He was like, enough of this.
Yeah.
Like, I'm so tired of this dude catching footballs. And so they just absolutely bracketed him, like made Daniel Jones know pre-snap, this dude's not open, like look somewhere else. And there's only so much they can do because their other guys are not nearly as good as Malik Neighbors. You can't really do that if you also need to be in run support. And so if you can get in those third and long situations where they want to go to Neighbors and man-to-man and then still have the resources to double him, bracket him, and make sure that he can't beat you, that's a good formula for being successful. And I think as opposed to last time where it took them a bunch of quarters to go, wow, this rookie in his second game really is that good. You don't know what you don't know. This time they know. And so I think how they treat Neighbors is something for sure to watch. And whether it's St. Juice following him, which I know gives people the heebie-jeebies, and not exactly like that's an advantage in New York, obviously, but it's probably the best. It might be the best shot that Washington has. Although Sainer still, his competitiveness, that's an interesting thought as well. But we'll see, obviously, what they can do and how Joe chooses to play it. Anything else on the defensive side of the ball that you wanted to point out before we say goodbye here, Logan?
I think the thing, you mentioned like what are some tools they could use. I just keep an eye out for like kind of some line movement on first and second down to kind of allow you to play a lighter box if you're Joe Whitt Jr., if you want to kind of keep those coverage structures tight. And again, like I don't think I just want to make this point very clear. I don't think Daniel Jones is playing badly. He's just not elevating and making the plays that he has to make. And so if you can keep him doing that, I think there's a really good opportunity for you to win this football game, kind of walking away. So really excited. Always excited for divisional matchups. And I think there are some really compelling storylines on the offensive side and defensive side of the football for the Commanders. And I think the main thing is, can they, I don't know, what's the word I'm looking for? Can they play consistent football? Can they come off this emotional high of the Bears game? Yeah. And do what we expect them to do to the Giants? Can they be them? Yeah. Or who they've been so far. Just because you've done it so far doesn't guarantee anything moving forward, but certainly makes us feel, I think, a little bit better than we felt about a lot of teams years past. And frankly, like most teams around the NFL. I think they are more emotionally intelligent, if you will, than a lot of football teams because of how they handle their business. All right, that's Logan Paulsen. You can catch him also on the Command Center show, the Game Plan show with Dan Quinn, all that stuff over on the Commanders YouTube. I'm Craig Hoffman. You can check me out on the radio 4 to 7 every single day
on the Team 980. And we will be live on Sunday night. Well, I will be live Sunday night because it's a road game on the Team 980 and 106.7 The Fan YouTube pages with a mystery guest to be determined that I just realized I need to coordinate and figure out. So currently it's still a mystery to me, but we'll have it straightened out. One of my colleagues over at Team 980 and 106.7 The Fan will join me for post-game reaction at 7:30 p.m. For Logan, I'm Craig. We'll see you Tuesday for the tape review show. Until then, have a great weekend and enjoy the game. Thanks for watching this clip of Take Command, which has a brand new home.
That's right. You can watch on YouTube at the Team 980.
You can also listen to full episodes in the free Odyssey app, which is now enabled with Apple CarPlay. So we'll just, follow you around.